Thank you for joining us for this evening's program. Tonight, we welcome Thomas Wright. I'm Claire Noble, and on behalf of Chris Sable, the Vail Symposium Executive Director, Dale Mosier, the Board Chairman, and the entire Vail Symposium Board, welcome. The Vail Symposium has been convening locally and thinking globally since 1971. Two items to be aware of before we get started. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see an option for Q&A. That's where you'll type your questions for tonight's speaker. We'll get to those questions a little bit later in the program, and we'll get to as many questions as time permits. Tonight's program will run until 7 p.m. It's being recorded, and you'll be able to find that recording at vailsymposium.org. I'd like to take just a moment to thank the organizations and individuals who've helped make tonight's program possible. Our sponsors include the Town of Vail, the Vail Daily, Vail Resorts Epic Promise, and the Antlers at Vail. Our virtual programs are sponsored by Alpine Bank. Jeannie and Dale Mosier have underwritten the winter season. Cindy Ingalls has underwritten the Geopolitical series. And tonight's underwriters are Jody and Arthur Israel. The Vail Symposium is also supported by a generous grant from the Frechette Family Foundation. Thank you to our donors at every level who make our programming possible. Our next program takes place on Tuesday, February 15th, and features evolutionary biologist Heather Hayne and Brett Weinstein. They are the authors of the recently released book, A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century. Tonight's program focuses on Thomas Wright's research on how nationalism and major power rivalries constrained the response to the worst pandemic in a century. The COVID-19 crisis exposed the limits of the old international order. Thomas Wright is the director of the Center for the United States and Europe and a senior fellow with the Project on International Order and Strategy at the Brookings Institution. He's also a contributing writer at The Atlantic, a non-resident senior fellow at the Lowry Institute for International Policy in Sydney. His latest book, co-authored with Colin Cowell, is Aftershocks, Pandemic Politics and the End of the Old International Order. Wright has a doctorate from Georgetown University, a Master of Philosophy from Cambridge University, and a bachelor's and master's from University College Dublin. He has also held a pre-doctoral fellowship at Harvard's University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs and a postdoctoral fellowship at Princeton University. He was previously executive director of studies at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and a lecturer at the University of Chicago's Harris School for Public Policy. Just a reminder to our audience to please type your questions in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. I'll turn the program over to Tom, and please, Tom, invite me back when you're ready for audience questions.
Great, Claire, thank you so much. And thank you to Chris and also to Dale and to everybody at the Vail Symposium. I'm only sorry I can't be there in person. The last time I was there, I think, was a few years ago now, and I was speaking alongside Judy Smith, who of course is now the US ambassador to NATO and is deeply engaged in the Russia crisis, which seems to be taking up most of my time as well at the moment. So if anything, it's a relief and a little bit of a break to go back to talking about the book and about COVID, which of course is, also still a major international challenge. So I'm really looking forward to talking with you about that and looking ahead a little bit to, if not the post-pandemic world, to some of the challenges we have as we try to exit the pandemic and some of the geopolitical repercussions. But I thought, Claire, what I would start with is really a little bit of a description about how Colin and I began to write in the book in the first place, because I think that does, tell us a little bit about sort of what motivated and also some of the problems we were wrestling with. Because in March of 2020, when the world began to shut down, as COVID sort of spread to the United States and it already spread in Europe, I think there was a sense that this was a moment of global crisis, along with the financial crisis from 08, 09, maybe other crises in the past that required global cooperation but it came at a time when the world was dominated by nationalism and by nationalist leaders, not just Donald Trump, in the United States, but Xi Jinping in China, Modi in India, Bolsonaro in Brazil. It had come after a very difficult decade when populism and dissatisfaction in institutions and authority had grown, when there was still an overhang from the financial crisis and some pressures on the central banking system. It had also come at a time of real crisis, I think, for the multilateral system, and not just because of the leaders, but a sense that those old institutions had broken down. So when we started to think about writing this, we thought what we'd like to do is to try to document in real time how the world coped or failed to cope with this really existential shared challenge. Would the world come together or would it be divided? And we wanted to do that sort of analytically with an analytical narrative as the crisis developed. So we benefited considerably from the amazing work that many journalists and researchers obviously did on COVID, throughout the crisis. And we availed of that since obviously we couldn't travel. We wanted a global, perspective, but we supplemented, that research, that publicly available research, with a series of 75 or so interviews of senior government officials from the United States and around the world to try to really get a sense of what was happening behind the scenes. And we talked to many of those officials on multiple occasions. So in the spring of 2020, in the summer, when it looked like the pandemic was abating, in the fall, when it was coming back, in that very difficult winter of 2020-21 after the US election, and then again in the spring of 2021, to really try to get a sense of the tempo, because their mood and their views, I would say, evolved and changed, as the crisis evolved and changed. So that was sort of our approach. I think just to flag it at the beginning, I think our major finding was that geopolitical rivalries and the geopolitical condition of the world did constrain, limit, and shape, the international response. We did not see the traditional type of cooperation and even leadership that you would normally expect in a moment like this. There's never a good time for a pandemic, but arguably this one hit at the worst possible time. And there is a contrast, especially with the financial crisis of 08, 09. So that's sort of just an overview of what we were trying to do. I think what I'll do in the time I have is just talk through some of the major, findings. And I will start in the case of China, because of course, China was a very significant actor here. And as we were sort of, the outbreak started in Wuhan and then spread from there. But when we started sort of looking at the China picture, we actually found ourselves drawn back to 2003, 02, 03, with the outbreak of SARS in southern China. And that's sort of where our story starts. In the SARS epidemic, we did see initial failures by the Chinese government that were remarkably similar to those with COVID. An initial cover-up, some secrecy, some repression of some of the key individuals. But what was interesting was that the Chinese government did alter course after some explicit criticism from the WHO. They then set in place a series of reforms, including a strengthening of the Chinese CDC, new regulations to ensure there was more rapid transmission of information from the provinces to the central authorities, more cooperation with the international community. We began to see Chinese scientists participating in WHO efforts, and globally, a more sort of network cooperation with the United States and others. And so those reforms were put in place after 03, and they were implemented in various health emergencies over the following 17 years. And as late as the summer of 2019, those reforms really formed the basis of a major exercise that the Chinese government undertook to respond to a pandemic. So we had seen significant progress really in China in how they were going to cope with a pandemic. what was remarkable and noteworthy about COVID was that many of those reforms essentially melted away when COVID-19 hit. Now, we had seen some attrition of them in the months and even years leading up to it. In the book, we talked to a lot of US public health officials who were stationed in Beijing at the US Embassy, and they described how the cooperation between their offices in Beijing and the Chinese government had sort of weakened in the run-up to COVID. But when COVID hit, the Chinese system sort of went silent and was quite secretive, of course, not really cooperating with the international community, repressing those voices inside China that were raising the alarm bells about COVID. And so it was a regression from what we had come to expect, the new sort of Chinese system to be. And I think that's an important point, not just in analyzing, what happened in COVID-19, but also thinking about the prospects of future cooperation with China. How can we be guaranteed, in a sense, that China will abide by future reforms and commitments, that it makes? But if initially there was sort of a delay because the authorities in Wuhan were reluctant to share information with Beijing, there's really no question that from early January on, we did see Xi Jinping taking control and really doubling down on that secretive and relatively uncooperative approach. They, of course, did succeed in suppressing the virus in those early days, but that sort of spirit of non-cooperation with the WHO and the international community continued throughout 2020, and we saw it accompanied, of course, by the wolf warrior diplomacy in Europe and in elsewhere, and linking development assistance and later vaccine assistance to geopolitical goals. I would say that the Chinese government was very nervous and genuinely scared of this crisis early on, but then after the virus was suppressed, largely they did, I think, contrast what they saw as their response with a weaker Western and US response. And it became, in their mind, sort of a vindication of the Chinese system and the geopolitical opportunity to press home their advantage. WHO officials told us that Xi Jinping was a different type of leader than Chinese leaders in the past. I'll come back to that in a few minutes, but they were worried that they could not push him in the way maybe that the WHO pushed the Chinese government back in 2003. The United States, of course, is the other key player in this, and we approached sort of the US case expecting to find that the administration had been asleep at the switch a little bit. We had read these reports about the administration getting rid of the International Health Directorate and the National Security Council. There was a sense, that they were that they might have been slow to respond, slow to mobilize the international community. But what we actually found was a more complicated story, and one of the reasons why was that the Deputy National Security Advisor at the time was a man named Matt Pottinger. Pottinger had been a Wall Street Journal reporter at the time of SARS. He had broken many of the stories the journal had about SARS, and he had family. A couple of members of his family were deeply engaged in the study of infectious disease and global public health. And so he, in his position, was quite aware, I think, at quite an early point of the dangers that COVID would likely pose. And of course, there were others like Tony Fauci, Robert Redfield, and others who were also quite aware of it. So actually what we found was that the Trump administration, the key officials within it, were probably more aware earlier than their counterparts in Europe or in many other parts of the world. And they did make some preparations in those crucial moments in January for what that would mean. But after the president imposed a partial travel ban on China at the end of January, what then happened was that the faction within the administration that favored a very robust approach failed to convince him to take follow-on steps. And he basically adopted a wait-and-see attitude because in an election year, he didn't want to disrupt the economy. And if you recall, while Trump's relations with China were very fraught throughout, the probably warmest moment in his administration in terms of US-China relations was actually in January of 2020, when the United States had signed a phase one trade deal with China with a view to the election in November and wanting to show that there was progress on the foreign policy and trade front. And so for Trump, he did not want to fight with Xi Jinping. At this point, he praised Xi Jinping publicly. He believed what he was told, that it was largely under control, but that was partially because he did not want to take any steps that might hurt the economy and therefore hurt his political prospects. When the penny dropped on March 11th, when he shut down the US economy, as it was already naturally shutting down on its own in anticipation of the pandemic, Trump then sort of turned on his dime and blamed Xi Jinping personally. We have some pretty colorful quotes in the book from that day, when he blamed Xi Jinping personally for having put him in that position, jeopardized his election chances. And at that point, I think that is the pivotal moment really in US-China relations, when he then gives those who favor sort of a tougher response to China a permission slip, as it were, to implement sort of tougher measures on export controls, economic tariffs, and a wide range of other sort of security measures. And that's compounded by China's actions in Hong Kong, that summer. And so I think what we can see really in the US response is a very is a key sort of change in the China policy. Unfortunately, I think that sort of focus on China, and one can agree or disagree, on that depending on one's point of view. But perhaps there was more of a focus on the China and the geopolitical dimension than maybe on the international public health dimension. And so the WHO issue was largely seen through the prism of competition with China. The relations with the rest of the world in terms of mobilizing a response was seen as trying to contain some of the negative effects of China's response. And so what we see throughout 2020 is sort of a very geopolitical focus. So for instance, at the G7 meetings that Mike Pompeo participated in, they largely ran into difficulty because of the question of what to call the virus, whether it was called the Wuhan virus, the China virus, or something else. And so that, I think, was a persistent feature of the US approach throughout 2020. The US relations with the WHO have gotten a lot of attention. We try to get into that and dig deep into that in the book. And what we basically found there really was that the United States Trump did not intend to formally leave the WHO. He was trying, in a way, to spark a negotiation with the WHO leadership, but he consistently sort of moved ahead of his negotiators or cut the ground out from under them by preempting his own deadlines. And what we found by June was that he was sort of blaming the WHO as a part of the blaming of China, and that the US was sort of exiting almost by default. And we have a significant number of interviews with the US ambassador to the WHO during that time, Andrew Bremberg, where we sort of detail what those negotiations looked like. There were several moments, I think, where a compromise was possible, but ultimately, though that sort of broke down, and it broke down particularly in May, where we sort of document the president and gave a press conference, and in order to sort of beef up a speech he was giving in China, he announced a very short-term deadline to pull out of the WHO or to cease funding of the WHO if he didn't get a certain number of concessions. So that relationship was quite fraught throughout 2020 as well. The Europeans, I think, are often contrasted with, and particularly Angela Merkel with Donald Trump and the US approach, but it was a very difficult crisis for the EU. They, I think, really struggled at different parts of this. They were remarkably slow at the beginning of the crisis to really understand the gravity of it. We show in the book there were a number of instances where the Italians and others warned about the risks of this, but meetings were delayed for sort of 12 or 13 days to formulate a response in those crucial weeks of February. And then when March hit and the reality really came home, it was really every country for itself. And what we found was that France, Sweden, Germany, and others were really engaged in an uncoordinated scramble for critical medical supplies. Everybody was focused on the domestic crisis, how to address that, and not so much on EU cooperation. Certain EU countries, particularly Spain and Italy, were affected more than others at the beginning, and that happened to fall along the fault lines from the Euro crisis. And so by the end of March, there really was a feeling in the EU that it could pose an existential threat to the Union itself, particularly if there was no concessions on the economic front to allow countries like Italy more fiscal flexibility in EU rules and how they responded to it. And so the EU officials we talked to, there really was a sense that they were at the brink in March and April of 2020. And it was Merkel, Macron, and others that pulled back from the brink and said, okay, health policy is not a core competency of the EU. EU leaders have never really worked together on health because that's been the preserve of member states. But if we are to show that the European Union is a positive force in people's lives, we need to change that and really, in this moment of crisis, develop new mechanisms for cooperating in a public health crisis. And so we did see from that point forward, I think, a switch in European policy. We saw a very assertive approach by the European Central Bank, which I'll come to in a moment. But we also saw the EU come together for the first time and agree about the mutualization of liabilities. So basically common debt instruments that were seen as a key sort of shortcoming of the financial crisis. They agreed to do it in response to COVID-19. By the summer of 2020, there really was a feeling of almost triumphalism in Europe that they had conquered COVID-19, that the EU had emerged stronger. There was a contrast to the United States, where, of course, the pandemic was raging through the South and Midwest and other parts of the country in the summer of 2020. And the Europeans, I think, felt that they had come out of it in the other direction. But of course, when the fall and then the winter of 2020-21 hit, it revealed a very different picture. Europe was much less prepared. In some way, that relaxation in August in particular led to the spread of new variants throughout Europe. And those pressures on the EU really emerged over the vaccine, where the US had invested $18 billion in Operation Warp Speed to develop vaccines as rapidly as possible. They had also cut corners in terms of some of the bureaucratic and financial constraints on vaccine development. Europe had done none of that. It has spent a fraction of that funding, less than $3 billion in total, and have insisted on a set of sort of bureaucratic constraints that impeded the rapid development of vaccines. So all of that meant that we went through in fall 2020 that the maybe the states did in sight. On the overall European fatality and all of the fatalities, it's actually relatively even. I think Europe, last time I checked, was higher, larger populations were lower.
I hope you'll bear with us just a moment. Oh, we've got Tom back. Thank you.
I'm back. I'm sorry. Did I just cut out in the middle?
Yeah, you were starting to sound underwater, but you're back now, so we can just keep moving.
Okay, I'm sorry. It just all of a sudden cut out. I'm sorry for any, just to intervene, Claire, if there's any audio difficulties here, and I'll see what I could do. I think I was just sort of talking, just finishing up on the European piece, and I was sort of arguing that after, you know, the European difficulties with the vaccination, with the vaccine development, there was, I think, a new crisis moment in the EU, exacerbated in a way by the UK's sort of success in vaccine diplomacy or vaccine development having left the EU. And so we saw sort of a resurgence of some of that questioning about the value of the EU, the value of being part of a common union on public health issues. And that in some ways was eased in the spring of 2021 when we did see Europe sort of catch up. But overall, I think the main point I wanted to communicate was that this was a very difficult crisis for the EU. I think they've emerged stronger from it, but I think it has been quite difficult for them. And they did not have, in many ways, sort of a good pandemic, as it were. The final actor I just wanted to talk about before I get on to some of the general sort of takeaways is the World Health Organization. And the WHO, of course, was very much a villain of the peace, I guess, for the Trump administration. They controversial, of course, in their initial dealings with China. We talked to a number of WHO officials, and we also talked to a number of officials from governments who dealt with the WHO. We try to document as objectively as we can sort of what really happened there with the WHO throughout COVID. And I guess the main sort of thing we would say is that when you look at the Director General, what Tedros's sort of response, you know, he has this pandemic hit at a moment where I think they feel really stuck between Xi Jinping on the one hand, Donald Trump on the other. They're aware they're in quite a hostile geopolitical environment. They believe that Xi Jinping is less forgiving of criticism than maybe his predecessors were. They feel that other countries don't really have a strategy to secure cooperation from China in any way. And so Tedros sort of decides that he will use his own personal diplomatic ability to sort of feel his way around, praise China's response where it's helpful, and hopefully secure some practical cooperation from Beijing, which he does in late January with a visit. They get some data sort of shared from there. But that contrasts very much with a view in the United States and in certain other quarters, which is that in order to actually secure real cooperation from China, you have to honestly sort of call out their response for what it was. And the WHO, we know from leaks of internal documents in the media, were quite critical of China's response. And so the US view was that by objectively sort of stating what China's track record was, that would put sort of additional pressure on Beijing to share vital information and vital data that was intrinsically important to the response to the pandemic. So that was sort of the philosophical difference that really animated those tensions. It's interesting that in 2021, Tedros sort of changed his approach, and when the WHO was trying to get access to China for the origins investigation, and China wasn't cooperating, and then the team went and said that a lab leak was basically impossible, Tedros publicly contradicted them because he did not believe that there was sufficient data available to be able to form a definitive judgment one way or the other. So what we did see, I think, later on in the WHO's response, that they were more willing to be critical, but in that critical sort of crucial early period, they were not sort of willing to do that. That, I think, was less about sort of Tedros's view of China and more about his predisposition, I think, to world leaders, where he had sort of a non-confrontational approach to them. But for much of the world, the US focus on criticism of the WHO was sort of premature. Many of them had sort of criticisms of their own, but they didn't believe that the time to express those criticisms was in the middle of a pandemic. So the European view was there's plenty of time to do that later on, after the pandemic, but we really need to focus on the task at hand that we have right now. So that's some sort of just thoughts on the overall, on the main sort of actors. I'll make just a few points, and then we can move to the conversation in terms of the major takeaways. There were, I think, some unexpected successes in terms of the response to COVID-19. I would make two observations there. The first was the financial response by the US Federal Reserve and by the European Central Bank and other central banks was astonishing. They were worried, and we talked to a number of officials, some senior officials from those institutions. They were incredibly worried early on that the financial crash could be worse than in 2008-09. The Federal Reserve particularly worried about the US Treasury market. They acted with extraordinary sort of haste and urgency and on a very large scale, doing things they did not do in 08-09 to try to save the economy. In that, they largely succeeded. And the fiscal response, I think, also prevented mass unemployment beyond, the effects of mass unemployment in terms of federal payments to workers who were hit by the pandemic. And we saw something similar in European countries. So the economic response, I think, was surprisingly successful, certainly more successful than many analysts anticipated at the beginning. And the other piece, which I've mentioned, is Operation Warp Speed and vaccine development, where I think, and we try to document this in the book, but that I think really was a big bet by the United States. And it's sort of a very American approach of trying to invent sort of one's way out of a crisis. But that I think also had considerable benefits. But while there were successes, there were also, as the title of the book suggests, sort of aftershocks throughout the world that weren't coped with as well. I won't sort of get into it in my formal remarks, but we try to document in the book the effect on countries like Bangladesh, Peru, and many others who have sort of done quite well over the last 2 decades, but got hit incredibly badly by the economic effects of COVID-19, setting back their development by several years. India, as well, as another example where the shutdown approach did not, I think, work particularly well. They did not get hit by COVID-19 early on. That waited till the spring of 21 with Delta, but they were hit by mass sort of migration problems and other economic problems resulting from a premature shutdown of the economy. And we then also saw in many parts of the world, in more repressive parts of the world, sort of the use of some surveillance measures for political purposes. So we try to sort of show in the book this was a global crisis with global aftershocks. I would just finish with some sort of comments on where we go now and maybe the overall strategic implications of the crisis, because I think what it demonstrated to us was this intersection of geopolitical risk and geopolitical rivalry on the one hand, and transnational threats like COVID-19, but also like climate change on the other, and how there's a negative synergy between both of those phenomena. We are in some ways experiencing a near worst case scenario for each at the same time. And our challenge is how to basically deal with pandemics and other transnational threats at a time when cooperation is essentially broken, and then how to manage the geopolitical consequences and escalation that results from those threats. One sort of tempting out in that is to say the world ought to come together and cooperate on these challenges. And we certainly favor that as an outcome. But I think the lesson of 2020-21, or 2020 in particular, is that we can't assume that in the future. So we need to try to build an international order that will work, even if there is significant rivalry between the member states, particularly between the United States and China. And that's why in the book, we call for re-engagement with the WHO. We call for efforts to try to cooperate with China, but we also acknowledge that the United States needs a backup plan if that does not work. So we need a way, essentially, to be able to increase international cooperation, even if we can't get strong reforms at the WHO. And in the book, we sort of show how we would try to do that in a way by forming a coalition of like-minded countries, something we call the Global Alliance for Pandemic Preparedness, which would be of countries that are willing to commit to higher levels of transparency, to spend more money on public goods in the domain of international public health, to do more on the vaccination side, to in a way set a higher standard. And we believe that that would reinforce the WHO instead of undermining it. And so that, I think, is sort of a key part of our approach. I would just finish with just a comment on where we're at. I think, the pandemic obviously is still, unfortunately, very much with us. We've just been through, I think many people have been through a couple of quite difficult and unexpectedly difficult months. Hopefully, this year, I think maybe Omicron was sort of the last sort of big wave. There might be more sort of, herd immunity as a result of so many people having gotten it. But I do think that we also still have this huge issue of global vaccines. And that's not just a matter of supply. I mean, many people have gotten one dose at this point, but it is a matter of distribution and also of the continuing booster shots. And Omicron, I think, really illustrates to us, the importance of a global response to this. And I would just finish, Claire, with one sort of observation, which is I think as we look at this international picture, we really need to think about the global vaccine challenge, not as a matter of development assistance or foreign aid, and really as the latest front in sort of an existential struggle against COVID-19. And that, I think, that mindset, I think, means that we ought to be doing more, spending more, investing more, as we try to accomplish that. But I'll wrap up there. I hope the audio is okay. I'm sorry for the drop and look forward to the conversation.
No, that you're fine. I can hear you loud and clear. So I'm hoping our audience can as well. So when you and Colin embarked on this journey, this endeavor, I'm curious as to whether or not you were approaching this as somewhat pessimistic, optimistic. Were one the pessimist, the other the optimist? Would you characterize either of you in that regard, not knowing the twists and turns that this COVID journey would take?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think we were both somewhat pessimistic, but we try to have sort of an open, mind on it. I think we had certain hypotheses at the beginning. We both wrote our separate articles, on the impact of COVID, which is how we've known each other for a while, but when we both wrote those articles, that's when we got talking about possibly a book. But I do think we came at it from slightly different but compatible angles. So I was probably focused a bit more on the China piece, the geopolitical piece. I think Colin, was very interested in both the history angle, but also in particular the global piece and how this affected the developing world and conflict zones. And I think I learned from him a lot just in terms of the ways in which this impacted, countries all around the world. And so one of the things I think that we did, that he I think was instrumental in was really trying to, write a lot about places like Bangladesh, Peru, Rwanda, and others that were pretty dramatically affected, by COVID-19, that I think it's easy to sort of overlook and to have sort of a developed world centric, approach. And so, so I think we had sort of slightly different, angles, but I think we both, it was hard to be optimistic, I guess, in March of 2020 about where this was going. But as I said, one just final thing is like we were both, critics of the administration, but I think we did try, and hopefully those who've read the book can be the judge, but I think we tried to be, objective in that. And we did give the administration praise, I think, in a number of places and criticism in others. But what we really wanted to try to do was try to tell the story of the different perspectives. So on the WHO, for instance, we tried to explain where the Trump people were coming from substantively, and also what the WHO were thinking in response, and really let the reader sort of make up their own mind in a way.
So in your remarks, you discussed the parallels between COVID and SARS, but in your book, you go back to the Spanish influenza. I know that's a whole chapter and you can't get into that, but can you so it blew me away how impactful the Spanish flu is. I think anybody just generally aware of world history knows that it came on the heels of World War II, but it had a significant impact on World War II. And really geopolitics in the coming decades. Can you just address that, give the audience a little taste of what you covered in the book?
Yeah, no, thanks for asking. It's an easy piece to leave out of the presentation, because you could do a whole lecture on the impact of the influenza on World War I and the aftermath. And, we talked about including that and whether to include it or not. And I think we felt ultimately, that it was important to include, because I think it does show how the impact of the pandemic can be fairly subtle, but also pretty dramatic, right? And particularly on contingent events. So who gets sick and who doesn't get sick. I mean, the fact that Wilson was affected did change the course of history. The German army was more affected maybe than the Allied army. And so we tried to sort of show that in the book. I would say in terms of the impact in the war, this is a major issue of debate amongst historians, but I think there is a case, and we try to make it that, I think with the contingent nature of the influenza, it did have a disproportionate impact on certain actors and also obviously on key individuals. What's sort of interesting though is when you get to the aftermath part, this was an influenza that claimed, tens of millions of people, killed tens of millions of people. It's hardly mentioned in many of the books and studies about the breakdown of order, after World War I. But it did, I think, create sort of the context for some of the problems, that emerged later. It was suppressed, I think, in part because of the horrors of the war. And so, the pandemic hit us at a more benign time. So its impact was more pronounced, whereas they got it at the end of a very horrific period where maybe it was easier to be sort of, conflated with what had previously, happened. But I think geopolitically, it did have significant consequences, not least with the impact, as I mentioned, on President Wilson.
So you mentioned a kind of nuanced approach to how the Trump administration, how there were people such as Matt Pottinger, and to an extent also H.R. McMaster, who this was, they took this seriously and they were very concerned about it. China seemed to be a different story. It seemed to be there were individuals in China who showed a tremendous amount of bravery and paid for that, but that they were up against kind of the governmental machine in China that was controlling the narrative. For instance, right now, China is claiming that they've only experienced a little over 4,600 deaths from COVID. Does that ring true to you?
It's a great point, and I think we saw a lot of heroes in China in the response, and a lot of people who were trying to figure it out at a moment when there was deep uncertainty, heroic sort of medical officials, some of whom died obviously as a result of trying to treat COVID. And so I think, obviously they were the first country to experience it as well, and the fear and the uncertainty was very acute at that moment. And so I think it's really important to sort of state that. And even with the Chinese government's response, I think we should cut them some slack in terms of, initial missteps. I mean, there's hardly a government around the world that did not perform missteps at different parts. So I think some confusion, some incompetence even in an initial response, I think is definitely forgivable. And they did certain things in terms of the scale of the response and building of hospitals and the like that were unprecedented at that time. All of that said, though, I think when Xi Jinping took the reins on January 7th or so of 2020, they did have a choice. They could have said, we are going to reward those who are speaking up. But they didn't. They punished them. They could have said, we're going to share as much information as we can, but they didn't. The sharing of the genetic sequencing of COVID, which is absolutely vital to the world's response, that occurred because a Chinese scientist and an Australian-based counterpart defied a Chinese government order not to share that information, and they leaked it anyway. And then that Chinese scientist was reprimanded afterwards. And so that may never have been, well, certainly not on that timeline, not have been released at that time, if those rules had been followed. So I think there was a choice made, and I think it was about protecting the regime. It was about regime stability, and I think the world, did sort of suffer as a consequence of that, and I think we saw, a response later which compounded, those problems. So I think there was I might have missed can you just remind me the very final part of your question there, because I think I might not have addressed it.
No, I think you have, yes.
Okay.
So our next question comes from Judy, and she's asking about the UN and in particular the WHO. And in your book, you talk a lot about how the Trump administration was actually trying to get Tedros to reform the WHO and was trying to push them in that direction. And it's interesting because on the one hand, you have the bureaucracy, but then on the other hand, it really felt like your book in many places was about personalities, about people like Tedros taking a particular approach. Where do you think the WHO is at now? Because Judy's asking, it sounds like you don't think they're able to handle these major crises.
Well, I think to be fair, I think there's a lot of criticisms that can justifiably be made of the WHO's response. And I think they know that as well, that whatever they did, they were doing it in real time. Again, I think we need to cut them a little bit of slack on this. It's a very difficult environment. There will be many reports, there have been some already, that I think make some criticisms of them. So I think they were in a tough position. That said, I think Tedros did make a number of decisions, especially early on, that he didn't have to make. And I think, they went further in their praise, I think, of China than they needed to go. I think they knew internally that there were more problems, there. I think that they could have, I think, mobilized some sort of like-minded countries within the WHO system to put some gentle pressure, on Beijing. And I think they missed some opportunities there. I think I worry about the long term, because I think that it's clear they need more funding, they need more authority, they need to be able to enforce in a way, or at least have additional discretion to be able to encourage greater transparency, to be able to call things as they see it. But the reality is that, this issue is highly contentious between the major powers, and ultimately the major powers have to agree to any reforms of IHRs, of the international health regulations, and of the WHO itself. And I just don't think they're going to do that. After World War II, there was a lot of hopes that the United Nations, would help to keep the peace. And what we saw was that it became a zone of rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. I think the same thing is likely to happen here, that we'll see the US, maybe some other democracies, maybe a few others, really clash with China on the details of many of these reforms. And so I think the US should fully engage in that. I think it was a big mistake, to pull out of the WHO, but I don't think we should sort of expect that it will be able to transcend those rivalries, because ultimately, like the UN itself, the WHO is not independent of its member states, particularly its largest member states. It is reliant on them, and China has a lot of influence.
So next question comes from Mike, and he's asking you to kind of look into a crystal ball for the future and consider the scenario of Donald Trump being reelected as president in 2024 and the effect that would have on US relations with our competitor states, such as China and Russia, or our allies, such as Europe.
Yeah, well, obviously I don't think it will be a positive development, but I'll get to that in a second. Let me answer a slightly different question, which I think is related, because I think it takes it out of the Trump realm, but it's important. I think one thing I'm worried about at the moment, and I've been more worried since we finished the book, is sort of the partisanship surrounding attitudes toward viruses and pandemics, right? And as you mentioned earlier, Pottinger, there's O'Brien, there's there's Redfield, Debbie Birx, many others, Tom Cotton in the Senate, very controversial figure, but took COVID really seriously at the beginning, called for a very coordinated national response to it, including investments. There are many Republicans, I think, who took COVID very seriously. And, I think there are things they can take credit for, including particularly Operation Warp Speed. What worries me is that as we come out of this is really a lesson and a warning about preparing for the future. And are we going to, as a country, sort of come together and say, pandemics are a major threat, we need to be prepared for the next one? Or are we going to emerge from this with a large part of the country saying the problem was the overreaction, these things are actually not that bad at all, and we don't really want to do anything about sort of fixing our system to prepare for the next one, except banning certain responses because they're an infringement of liberty? Because regardless of what one's view is of COVID, the next one might be worse. It could be more lethal. It could affect young people as much as old people. That was certainly the case in the Great Influenza in 1819. So there's nothing about future pandemics that mean that they will not be worse than what we've just experienced. And I worry that we could take a lesson from it, which is that this whole thing is sort of overblown. And that sort of gets to the Trump point, because Trump was, while he was a bit all over the map, obviously, and I think made a huge number of mistakes in responding to it, it wasn't really till the summer that he began to be dismissive of it. It wasn't until that point. And then I think he really did double down on that. And having gotten it, he sort of really was still very dismissive of it. And there were arguably some other political leaders who were also dismissive of it. And so what I worry about, again, in the realm of public health, is a future president that simply is unwilling to sort of make the investments necessary to prepare for the next pandemic, on the assumption that, this is Omicron or something else, where it actually could be much worse. More generally on Trump, I think that's one of the big questions facing the country. I think, I think what would happen if he came back, the impact on America's role in the world, whether he would be more radical, even in a second term, than in the first on issues like NATO or others. I think that's a huge question that I don't think anyone knows the answer, to. There are certainly different views within the Republican Party on it. There are those who hope that some of the more mainstream elements will be influential in that administration. There are others who think they won't be.
Thank you. So in Foreign Affairs, Eikenberry characterizes the big takeaway from your book as this, that you make the case that the United States and our allies should give up on building a global system of governance and instead work together to address shared dangers while upholding the liberal international principles of transparency and accountability. Would you agree with that characterization? And then the second part of the question, and I know you said you were looking forward to a break from discussing Ukraine, but I'm going to bring that up as well. Do you think that's happening to a satisfactory degree with respect to Ukraine?
Yeah. So I think I sort of agree with, I guess what I would probably quibble with John, it's very kind review by John, but I think what I will quibble with is, I don't think we're saying give up. I think we're saying, fully engage in the WHO, try to work with China, try to find common ground on these shared challenges. We're just not very optimistic that it will work, that it will be enough. And so we say, to the extent there's a trade-off or a choice, it's important to work with like-minded countries and to do what we can without relying on China or others, other sort of countries that there may be major rivalries with. And so we call it basically a backup plan. It's not plan A, and it's not sort of designed to preclude cooperation. But it is, I think, realistic about what has happened and where we're headed. On Ukraine, yeah, I think that the response has been fairly impressive in terms of the unified approach by the allies. I don't know if it will be enough, because I don't know if Putin is deterrable, in this instance. But I think it has been vitally important. I think it's probably surprised him to some extent. He probably thought there would be a slower response and a more divided response. I think it's been impressive in a way how the Biden administration has managed to get allies on board with this. I think even though some were skeptical, I think that was probably helped by the fact that no one believes that the Biden administration was looking for this crisis or looking for an excuse, to get more involved in Ukraine. And so I think there was some added sort of credibility there when they warned of this back in November. But I think it is a major, major moment. I mean, what we're talking about here is possibly a large-scale invasion and dismembering of another country, a member, of the United Nations. We really haven't seen that since, Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. I think a major conflict at the heart of Europe would be hugely destabilizing and would be very difficult to contain. And I think preventing it from happening is vitally important, but very difficult. And I think what they're doing, because no one wants to go to war with Russia over this, so I think what they're doing is to try to sharpen the choices that Putin faces, so that if he does choose the invasion path, he will have immense costs and a much more difficult environment. Whereas if he takes the other route, he won't sort of get Ukraine, but he will have the opportunity for new arms control deals and other things that they wanted in the past. So I think that's sort of the choice they're trying to sharpen for him.
So we are just about out of time, and I had agreed to, or I let you know I wanted to give you the final word. And just revisiting a previous question, when you embarked on your book, whether or not you were pessimistic or optimistic, I'm just wondering what your general mood is right now regarding geopolitics. It sounds like somewhat optimistic with regard to how the United States and our allies have come together over Ukraine.
Well, I mean, optimistic in terms of the response, but pessimistic in terms of the challenges we face. I don't think any of these are getting any easier. I think we are in for a very rocky time with China. I think that's still sort of the long-term challenge. Hopes maybe that some people had that, we could focus on China and sort of slightly ignore Russia, I think have been obviously dashed. So we have a very difficult situation in Europe, a lot of challenges in Asia. And then there's that small little problem with the Middle East, where we're sort of hoping that doesn't, erupt as well in some ways. I think we're facing two really different challenges, like the return of geopolitical rivalry amongst major powers, and then these transnational threats, which are getting worse. And again, both of those, sort of negatively affect the other. So I think it is a very challenging environment, but I'm encouraged, I think, by the responses. But I think we have our work cut out for us for sure. But thank you so much. This is a really, I'm just sorry I couldn't be there, but thank you so much for hosting me again.
Tom, it was wonderful to hear from you tonight, and your book is fascinating, everybody. It's Aftershocks. Really wonderful book. Thank you for spending your time with the Vail community tonight. For everyone at home, thank you for joining us, and I hope you'll join us for our next webinar on February 15th, where we consider the Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century with Heather Hayne and Brett Weinstein. Good night, everyone.